welcome back to your number one source for cozy gaming and design content. I'm Nick, and today we're going to be taking a look at this little guy, the GKD Pixel. Let's start out by taking a look at what really sets this apart from its competitors, the size and materials. The most obvious feature that is evident right out of the gate is the size. It measures roughly 80mm by 56mm by 17mm. Now, you may be thinking that that's super small and there's no way you could possibly play comfortably on it. And you'd kind of hit the nail on the head. But I don't think that that's actually a bad thing. Something I think is super important when looking at a new product like this is taking the target audience into account. If I had to make a persona for this thing, they would probably be someone who wants to play in very short sessions, maybe on the bus or the train, and frankly, unless you have MKBHD-esque hands, this thing is going to be plenty comfortable for most games that you'd want to play in such short stints. On that note, they would probably be someone who likes retro games, but not someone who gets offended by inaccurate emulation or non-ideal aspect ratios. And they would probably have to be someone who doesn't care too much about the games past the Game Boy Color. In theory, this thing claims to be able to play up to PS1 games, and ignoring the widely varying opinions on whether or not the specs support this, I think from a form factor standpoint alone, that's really just not that reasonable. The position of the shoulder buttons and triggers are serviceable at best, but frankly, I think they're practically unusable. However, that's kind of where my complaints about this thing end. Well, except for the stock OS, but we'll get to that in a bit. The face buttons and D-pad are comfortable, and I didn't find myself having any trouble hitting the correct inputs with the correct timing. So even for games where timing is kind of critical, like Mario, I didn't find myself having any trouble making jumps or accurately positioning my character. In fact, and I don't know if this is just kind of the placebo effect or what, but I think I found myself doing better than I usually do in these games. If I had to attribute that to something other than my own brain, I would probably say it's likely because the button spacing isn't particularly far. I found it easier to do things like hit jump while still holding down run, and because the D-pad is so small, it takes considerably less time for my finger to roll to the next position. Now, I'm not saying that this is inherently better, and all competitive players should be playing with these tiny little controllers. However, I do think that it has its advantages, and more than you might initially think. And that just shows that you shouldn't write something like this off just because it looks kind of ridiculous. A lot of great designs start from a place of absurdity, and bring it back to the intended market. However, I don't think this, for its intended market, would even really qualify as ridiculous. Try to look at it from our persona's perspective. Sure, you and I know that if they want super high fidelity and accuracy, they should get an analog pocket, and if they want to play all the games they could ever want, then they should probably get a Steam Deck and load up EmuDeck. But we need to take a step back. For that person who really just wants to be able to fire up a game here or there and kill some time and doesn't really want to faff about with a huge handheld PC or pay the money and do the configuration it would take to use the analog pocket in this way, this is pretty much a godsend. They can pop it into their bag and not have to worry about the space it takes up because, frankly, it's negligible. And if they don't have a bag, that's not an issue either. This thing will fit into pretty much any pocket with ease. And I think that is, perhaps fairly obviously, where this product really shines, in its portability. Playing lighter games that only require the D-pad and maybe a couple of face buttons, and games that have either a save function built in or are designed, like Tetris, to be played whenever and wherever. And that brings us to the other distinguishing feature. Another hugely standout feature you get with this is its incredibly robust aluminum housing. If you're familiar with the pocketable retro handheld space, you'll know that while the quality of plastic varies from product to product, pretty much all of them are just that, plastic. And unless you want to spend the money to get a solid aluminum Game Boy Color shell on Etsy or somewhere else and do that mod, you're kind of stuck with plastic shells across the board. And to be clear, that's totally fine. All making in aluminum does is drive up the price and make manufacturing more complicated, while not really adding much in the way of functional durability. These aren't devices that are having great amounts of stress put on them, and for the most part, the worst it gets is getting jostled around in a bag or being given to a little sibling. And for those scenarios, a good ABS part is plenty robust enough. However, it is undeniable that the addition of an aluminum shell adds a massive boost to the hand feel. This feels solid in a way that even the analog pocket doesn't. It honestly just feels really great to hold. It's solid and sturdy, and the way the metal starts out cold to the touch but warms up slightly as you hold it is actually really nice. And from a modability and repairability standpoint, this gives the designers a lot more leeway in letting this device be easily serviceable. All you have to do is unscrew the chassis screws and take the two halves apart. And as regular viewers of this channel know, I'm a huge sucker for designs that trust the user enough to give them easy access to the screws. And while that's something that's certainly possible to do with a plastic part, the parting line would be much more difficult to pin down and make secure if you were to use this same simple attachment method. The aluminum housing also works to the benefit of their target audience, someone who wants to be able to take this with them and not have to worry about it too much. They even include a little lanyard mounting hole in case you want to attach it to your keychain. They clearly expect this to go with you pretty much everywhere, and in that intended scenario, it's very important that it be able to withstand drops, scrapes, and scuffs. So the choice to go with an aluminum shell helps them hit that target, while also giving the overall user experience a huge boost from a quality of life standpoint. The only place I think this choice falls a bit flat is in the colorways offered by GameKitty. Frankly, other than the black, I don't think that any of these options really look particularly good. I wanted to step out of my comfort zone and go for a slightly louder color than I usually would, so I chose green. And I'm already brainstorming ways to change it up. So stay tuned for that, because that might be a future video. There's this slight sparkle to the shell, which is unavoidable unless they're going to polish these down or powder coat them, which would have probably added significantly more costs. Frankly, I would have just preferred a bare aluminum shell to any of these anodizing options, or even a nice robust paint job. However, this isn't really a deal breaker because it's not like it takes away from the functionality or portability, which is the main selling point of a product like this. However, for me at least, I can't help but not love taking this with me. I don't love looking at it the way I do with something like the Analog Pocket, or even the original DMG Game Boy. And that's actually something I really appreciate in a product. Take my phone, for example. Sometimes I just take it out and hold it in my hands and look at all the interesting design choices that Teenage Engineering and Nothing made. For me, a delightful user experience is just as important as a functional device. I'm much less likely to want to take with me and use something that doesn't look and feel and sound good to use. So, for someone like me, the functionality of a product doesn't really matter if the user experience falls flat. There have been multiple times when I've bought something purely for the functionality just to find myself looking for an alternative a week later, which sure may give up one or two functions, but is much more pleasant and fun to hold, look at, and use. And I don't think any designer should just throw the baby out with the bathwater and ignore functionality in favor of a beautiful design. But I do think we, as customers, should seek out and reward designs that take a more holistic approach. Because just like dialing in the perfect espresso, the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. Not overly focused on functionality, but also not ignoring that in favor of aesthetic. Okay, now we're going to get to probably my biggest complaint with the GKD Pixel, the stock OS. To be clear, it's functional and serviceable. And it does have some pretty cool features, like the ability to change the skin to look a few different ways, which all look genuinely pretty cool. But, and I'm no UX UI designer, but this OS is clunky. It takes multiple clicks just to get into the core functionality, and the menus and file systems are confusing, and I definitely think would be off-putting to our persona that we derived from the industrial design on offer. I think this is a great example of what I talked about in the second CMF Watch video, and if you haven't seen that, I'll link to it here. But basically what I talked about is that sometimes the hardware and software teams seemingly didn't communicate and weren't on the same page about who this product was for. For that person who just wants to fire up a game on the bus, I find it hard to believe that they would want to sort through a rather obtuse file system just to find a game to play. And given how many games rather dubiously come pre-installed on here, it can take an unacceptable amount of time to find what you're looking for. And that is where MinUI comes in. Basically, it just runs over top the stock OS and is incredibly easy to install and get working. It lets you take all your games and sort them by console in a simple list on the home screen, available immediately when you boot the device. And within each folder, you find any ROMs you've moved to the corresponding system folder. It cleans up and massively simplifies the act of finding and playing a game, and adds great menus to adjust the emulator settings globally for a given console. Frankly, I think GameKitty should contact and partner with the developer Shinin, that guy, to include this firmware stock. It adds so much value to the device and cleans up what would otherwise be a quite frustrating and confusing user experience. Though, the fact that you need to do this at all is a potential downside for our persona. Again, I don't think this is meant for people who want to go onto GitHub and set up some new firmware and figure out how to install it. While that may be rather trivial or even a fun little side project for you and me, I think this is for people who want to buy a thing and use that thing as is. So while MinUI is an absolute gift for me, and I suspect a lot of you, I don't think it's really reasonable for GameKitty to ship something with an OS that's this bad. That's a difficult question to answer. I'm trying to make a conceited effort with this channel not to make blanket statements about whether or not you should buy a product, but instead give you the information you need to make the choice for yourself. Like I said at the start of this video, every product has a target audience, and just because a product may not be for me, doesn't mean it's not for anyone. So if you've been watching this B-roll and think, man, that looks really cool, I could do A, B, and C with it, or play it at this place or that, then I think, yeah, definitely pick it up. I really don't think you'll be disappointed. But also, make sure you go in with the right expectations. This isn't a do-it-all device that can play all the games you might want to play perfectly. It's a fun and cool little emulator with some interesting, distinguishing features that make it really nice to have and use, but definitely not an endgame emulator or anything like that. And because everyone is at different financial situations, I really don't think I can make any definitive statement about the price. Other than that, I think it's pretty impressive that they were able to make an all-aluminum handheld with buttons that feel this good for just about $80. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments how you feel about teeny little handhelds like this. Do you think you're going to pick one up? Either way, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and happy gaming.